I was 3 weeks away from my wedding when I overheard my fiancé discussing a cargo of illegal hardware and a plan to finalize my liquidation. I quickly realized I wasn't just his future wife. I was a prototype being groomed for replacement by a shadow organization. And now, my only way to survive is to become a ghost. The silence in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the espresso machine in the corner of the cafe. I sat in a secluded booth, my laptop open, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a spreadsheet. In reality, I was just enjoying the anonymity of the busy city center. My fiancé, Elias, was meeting a business associate at the table directly behind me. I hadn't planned on eavesdropping, but when I heard him speak a language I hadn't known he possessed, Uzbek, my fingers froze on the keys. Elias was a man of calculated elegance. He was a diplomat, or so he told me, a man whose work took him across the globe to smooth over international tensions. We were 3 weeks away from a wedding that was already being called the social event of the season. I loved him, or at least, I loved the version of him he projected to the world. Steady, charming, and deeply devoted. The fact that he was speaking Uzbek wasn't the shock. He was a polyglot, a man of the world. It was the tone of his voice that turned my blood to ice. It was cold, sharp, and stripped of all the warmth he usually reserved for me. "The delivery is scheduled for Tuesday," he said. His voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. "The cargo must be moved before the internal audit begins. If the Služby vnútorní bezpečnosti catches a whiff of this, we are all finished." My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at my screen, not seeing the numbers, my vision blurring. He spoke of the shipment as if it were a delicate chess move. I understood enough to know that this wasn't about diplomacy. This was something darker. The man opposite him, whose voice was gravelly and unrefined, replied in a hurried, panicked tone. They spoke of a grupa that was operating in the shadows of the port districts, and then, the words that made the room spin, "Nezakonное оружие." I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt as if they were filled with wet sand. He wasn't talking about diplomatic gifts or international trade. He was talking about trafficking hardware that could burn entire cities to the ground. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to drop them beneath the table, gripping my knees to keep from trembling. I had known Elias for 4 years. I had met his parents in Geneva, seen him volunteer at charity galas, and watched him weep at the sight of a stray puppy. Was it all a mask? Was I living with a stranger who was playing a role more convincing than any I had ever seen on screen? "And the packages with the prohibited substances?" the associate asked, his voice barely rising above the noise of the cafe. "The client is getting impatient. They want the quality verified by Friday." Elias let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Tell them to be patient. We aren't amateurs. If we push this too hard, we'll be looking at an ogromny srok that will keep us in a cage until we rot. Do you want to spend the rest of your life looking at the sky through a grid of wire?" I closed my eyes, a silent prayer forming on my lips. Every instinct I had told me to stand up, turn around, and confront him. But what would that achieve? If he were capable of this, if he were entangled in such a web of deceit, what would he do to a witness? The thought was paralyzing. I wasn't just a partner anymore. I was a liability. The associate shifted in his chair, and I heard the rustle of a heavy envelope being slid across the mahogany surface. My mind raced through the implications. If I walked away now, he would know I had heard something. If I stayed, I was an accessory to the most terrifying reality I could imagine. I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. Just as I mustered the courage to stand, Elias's voice rose, losing its guarded edge. "She's getting suspicious," he said, and my entire world stopped spinning. He was talking about me. "She's been asking questions about the trip to the border. I need to make sure she's taken care of before the wedding, or I'll have to orchestrate a permanent solution to this headache." My breath hitched in my throat. a tiny, sharp sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet corner of the cafe. Elias went deathly silent. The scrape of his chair against the hardwood floor sounded like a scream. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. But then I felt a shadow fall over my table, and the smell of his expensive, familiar cologne, sandalwood and citrus, wafted over my shoulder, followed by his hand resting heavily on the back of my chair. "Darling," he whispered, his voice dangerously sweet, "you really shouldn't linger in public places alone. It's so terribly unsafe." The proximity of his hand, resting on the back of my chair, felt like a branding iron. I could feel the heat radiating from his palm through the thin fabric of my dress. I kept my eyes fixed on the spreadsheet, the same numbers blurring into meaningless static. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, and I knew that if I turned around, the terror in my eyes would betray me. I had to play the part of the oblivious, doting fiancé, even as my soul withered in the shadow of his deception. "Elias," I managed to say, my voice sounding unnaturally thin, though I was proud it didn't crack. I forced a small, tired laugh and finally turned to face him. He looked picture-perfect, his suit pressed to perfection, his hair immaculate, his eyes bright with a concern that I now realized was purely performative. "I was just finishing up some work. I didn't realize you were in the same cafe. I must have been so deep in my own world." I looked past his shoulder, searching for the associate, but the table behind him was empty. The man had vanished, as if he were nothing more than a ghost woven into the fabric of Elias's lies. Elias tilted his head, a gesture of affection that now struck me as calculated, almost predatory. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my skin. "You work too hard, my love," he murmured. "We have the wedding to think about. I don't want you exhausted when we finally exchange our vows. Why don't you head home? I have one more errand to run, but I'll meet you there later. I'll make us something special for dinner." The word home felt like a mockery. Did I even have a home anymore? Or was I just a tenant in a cage he had built specifically for me? As I stood up, gathering my things with hands that still refused to stop their subtle trembling, he kissed my forehead. It was a cold, dry contact. He didn't notice the slight recoil I managed to disguise as a shiver. "I'll see you later then?" I asked, forcing a smile that felt like it was carved out of stone. "Count on it," he replied, and for a split second, his eyes went cold, the light behind them dimming into something hollow. I didn't head home. I drove until the city skyline was nothing but a smudge of gray against the horizon, my mind looping through every word I'd overheard. The mention of the attempt to frame us with a tяжкое обвинение, that had to be what he was worried about if the internal auditors arrived. He wasn't just working with criminals, he was terrified of being caught, and he was willing to dispose of me to keep his secret. I pulled into a deserted parking lot and fumbled for my phone, my fingers slick with cold sweat. I had a contact, a distant cousin who worked in the fringes of digital security, someone who wouldn't ask why I needed to know how to track encrypted communications. But as I pulled up the messaging app, a notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was an anonymous message sent from a burner number. My breath hitched as I read the single line of text. "I saw you in the cafe. Don't go back to the house. Check the spare tire compartment in your car." My blood turned to slush in my veins. My car, his gift to me for our engagement. I didn't want to look, but the compulsion was absolute. I stepped out of the vehicle, the wind whipping my hair across my face, and knelt on the cold asphalt of the parking lot. I pried open the trunk, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm. I lifted the carpet lining, revealing the spare tire compartment. There was no tire there. Instead, there was a sleek black briefcase, cold to the touch, and nestled beside it, a folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, I opened the paper. It was a list of names, and at the bottom, in bold, unmistakable ink, was my own. Next to my name, the words were scrawled in an aggressive, hurried hand. Project Liquidation, Target A, neutralize before the ceremony. I dropped the paper, a scream dying in my throat as I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I spun around, and there stood a man I had never seen before, dressed in nondescript dark clothing. He wasn't Elias, but he carried the same cold, hollow look in his eyes. He held a small black object in his hand, and he wasn't smiling. "You weren't supposed to find the box, sweetheart," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But now that you have, the plan has moved up. We're doing this tonight." The man's presence was like a void, an absence of humanity that made the very air around us feel thinner. I stood frozen, the gravel crunching beneath my heels as I instinctively backed away toward the open trunk of my car. My mind was screaming, 1,000 frantic thoughts colliding. Run! Fight! Call for help! But my body remained paralyzed by the sheer weight of the threat. This wasn't a business associate or a nervous accomplice. This was the cleaner. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice sounding pathetic and small against the vast, empty backdrop of the abandoned lot. The man tilted his head, his eyes scanning me with the clinical detachment of a butcher eyeing a slab of meat. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow, measured step forward, the black object in his hand, an electronic device of some kind, humming with a low, rhythmic pulse. I glanced wildly at the car door, wondering if I could dive in and lock it, but the keys were still sitting in the ignition, and he was standing between me and the driver's side. "Elias said you were smart," the man said, his voice a flat, monotone drone. "He said you had a habit of being in the right place at the wrong time." He actually sounded regretful. That's a shame. Regret is a liability in this line of work. I gripped the edge of the trunk so hard my knuckles turned ivory. "If you touch me, he'll know," I lied, grasping for any scrap of leverage. "I've already contacted the Service of Internal Safety. They have the recordings. You're not just killing me, you're starting a war you can't finish." The man stopped, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. It was the first sign of life he'd shown, and it was far more terrifying than his cold indifference. "Internal safety? Darling, you haven't been paying attention. Do you think Elias would operate in the open without cover? The people you're thinking of? They're the ones who handle the logistics of the Grupa. They don't want you safe. They want you erased." He took another step, and I realized with a jolt of pure, primal terror that there was no way out. I was being hunted by the very people I had once assumed protected the law. My hand brushed against the side of the trunk, feeling the jagged edge of a metal lug wrench. My fingers curled around the cold, heavy steel. It was heavy, awkward, and likely useless against a professional, but it was all I had. "Why?" I demanded, desperate to understand the mechanics of my own death. "Is it just about the cargo? About the prohibited substances? Is a woman's life really worth that little to you?" "It's not about the substances," he said, moving closer now, his pace accelerating just slightly. "It's about the fact that you heard the language. You heard him speaking it, and you understood. You aren't just a witness. You're an anomaly. And in this organization, anomalies are corrected." He lunged. It was sudden, explosive, and terrifyingly efficient. I didn't think. I swung the lug wrench with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled rage I possessed. It connected with his shoulder, a sickening thud that sent him reeling back. He grunted, a sound of genuine surprise, and for a split second, his guard dropped. That was my chance. I slammed the trunk shut with a deafening clang, grabbed the keys from the ignition, and dove into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, a desperate, guttural sound that seemed to mock the silence of the night. I didn't wait to see if he was getting up. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning against the asphalt, leaving a thick line of rubber behind. I careened out of the parking lot, my heart slamming against my sternum. I drove like a madwoman, weaving through side streets and back alleys, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There was no one behind me. No headlights, no pursuit, just the dark, winding road ahead. I was safe for the moment, but where could I go? My apartment was out of the question. That was his territory. My friends were risks. I couldn't drag them into this nightmare. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, crumpled paper I had snatched from the briefcase. I pulled it out, trying to read it under the flickering glow of the dashboard lights. The names on the list were horrifying. Local officials, police captains, even the names of people I saw at my own coffee shop every morning. I was staring at a map of a conspiracy that spanned the entire city. Then, my eyes drifted to the very bottom of the page, where a handwritten note sat beneath the Project Liquidation heading. After the target is disposed of, deliver the drive to the contact at the central train station. Authorization code, Omega 7. I slammed on the brakes as a realization hit me like a physical blow. The contact. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 11:45 p.m. The train from the central station to the border, the one Elias always took for his diplomatic trips, left at midnight. If I went to that station, I would be walking directly into the center of the nest. But if I didn't, I would be a ghost. A woman without a past, running for a future that didn't exist. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my wrists ached. I had to know. I had to know what was on that drive, and I had to know how high this went. I turned the wheel hard to the left, heading toward the neon glow of the downtown rail yards. As I pulled into the deserted pickup lane, the station was eerily quiet. A single figure stood under the flicker of a platform light, smoking a cigarette, watching the entrance. I parked the car, my breath catching in my throat, and realized with a jolt of horror that the person waiting there wasn't a stranger. It was Elias. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't talking to an associate. He was standing perfectly still, his back to the platform, staring directly at my car. He knew I was coming. He had been waiting for me the whole time. As I reached for the door handle, his phone started to ring, and a moment later, my own phone, which I had forgotten was still in my purse, began to vibrate in a shrill, piercing tone. I didn't want to answer it, but the caller ID on my screen froze my blood. It was my own number, calling from my own house. The vibration of the phone against the passenger seat felt like a frantic insect struggling to escape its cage. I stared at the screen, the display glowing in the dark interior of the car. My name, calling. My own phone number, my own name, displayed in bold white text against the black background. How could this be? I looked out at the platform where Elias remained motionless, a silhouette carved from the cold night air. He didn't seem to hear the sound, or perhaps he was simply waiting for the inevitable moment when my resolve would finally buckle. I couldn't answer. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and declined the call. A second later, the screen lit up again. Another call from my home line. My heart was a drum beating a retreat, but my curiosity, that sharp, agonizing edge of the unknown, was winning. I tapped the green icon and held the phone to my ear, not saying a word. "You should have left the car," a voice whispered from the other end. It was my voice, exactly my inflection, my cadence, my pitch. It was like speaking to a distorted mirror. "He's watching the station entrance. If you walk through that door, you're just adding another name to the list." "Who are you?" I hissed, my eyes never leaving Elias, who had now begun to walk slowly toward my car, his movements fluid and predatory. "I'm the part of you that's still alive," the voice replied, sounding chillingly detached. "I'm the one who was supposed to be in the passenger seat tonight." Listen to me. There is a locker, number 402, in the basement of the terminal. The key is taped to the underside of your steering column. If you want to survive, stop trying to be a hero and start being a ghost. The line went dead, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush me. I reached under the steering wheel, my skin crawling, and felt the rough texture of adhesive tape. I peeled it back, and a small, antique iron key fell into my palm. My breath hitched. If someone had been inside my car, someone who knew my life, my secrets, even my own voice, then my reality wasn't just compromised. It had been rewritten while I wasn't looking. Elias was 20 feet away now. He was smiling, a thin, pleasant expression that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket, and I braced myself for the worst, expecting the glint of steel. Instead, he pulled out a pair of house keys and dangled them by the ring, the metal clinking softly in the quiet night air. "You left these on the counter, darling," he called out, his voice smooth, carrying easily across the distance. "I was worried you'd be stranded." It's a cold night to be wandering around without a destination. He reached the driver's side door, stopping just inches from the glass. He leaned in, peering at me, his eyes searching my face as if he were looking for a crack in my composure. I lowered the window an inch, the freezing air biting at my cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about, Elias," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I went for a drive to clear my head. You shouldn't have followed me." His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Followed you? I've been waiting for you to find the path, my love. It's hard to see the truth when you're blinded by sentimentality. Give me the keys. We're going to have a long conversation about what you found in the car." "I didn't find anything," I lied, gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned under my palms. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from mine, and the scent of sandalwood was suffocating. "Don't lie to me. I can see the fear in your eyes, and I know you think you have an ally, but the person you spoke to on the phone, they aren't going to save you. They're the reason I'm here." He reached for the door handle, but I didn't wait. I slammed the car into drive and punched the gas. The tires screeched, burning rubber against the concrete, and the vehicle lurched forward, forcing Elias to stumble back. I swerved around him, my heart slamming against my ribs, and sped toward the station entrance, hoping to find a way to the basement. But as I rounded the corner of the building, I slammed on the brakes again, my soul freezing in my chest. Blocking the path was a black SUV, and standing in front of it were two men in dark uniforms, the same insignia I had seen on the documents in the briefcase. They weren't there to stop me. They were standing at attention, waiting. And standing between them, holding a small, glowing tablet, was someone who looked exactly like me. She was wearing my coat, my scarf, and she was watching me with a look of profound pity. I looked at the woman, my double, and then back at my own hands, which were now glowing with a faint, iridescent light, as if I were somehow tethered to the device she held. The world began to tilt, the lights of the station stretching into long, distorted needles. The voice on the phone echoed in my mind. "Start being a ghost." The woman stepped forward, her features shifting like water, and she whispered something that made my stomach drop into an abyss. "The conversion is complete. You aren't the primary anymore. You're the prototype." The world distorted, the concrete beneath my tires feeling less like solid ground and more like a projection flickering at the edges. I stared at the woman, my mirror image, who stood under the harsh sodium light. Her presence was a glitch in my reality, a living testament to the sophisticated, terrifying depths of the organized scheme Elias had been running. They weren't just moving illegal goods, they were trafficking in something far more dangerous: the systematic replacement of individuals to infiltrate the highest tiers of societal control. The prototype, I whispered, the word tasting like copper on my tongue. The logic clicked into place with sickening clarity. Elias hadn't just been courting me, he had been studying me, logging my mannerisms, my speech, my secrets, all to create a version of me that he could control. The ghost I spoke to on the phone hadn't been an ally. She was the upgrade, the final version being prepared to take my place at the altar. The double smiled, an expression that lacked any trace of the soul I possessed. She tapped the tablet in her hand, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my temples. My vision flared with data, numbers, dates, names of the people I had seen on that list. It was a download. They were harvesting my memories, stripping me down to the raw data so they could ensure the replica was perfect. I didn't scream. Instead, I let the rage rise, cold and focused. I realized then that if I was a prototype, I had one advantage. I was still the one with the original access code. I didn't need to fight them with force. I had to fight them with their own architecture. My hands flew to the dashboard, not to drive, but to the integrated navigation console. I had worked in high-level data security before meeting Elias, a life I thought I had left behind. I bypassed the lockout, my fingers dancing over the touchscreen, injecting the Omega-7 code into the local network of the rail yard's grid. The effect was instantaneous. The streetlights overhead surged, turning a blinding electric blue. The SUV's electronics sputtered and died, its internal security systems locking the doors, trapping the men inside. The double looked at her tablet, her calm expression flickering into genuine confusion as the device sparked and went black. She looked at me, her face losing its rigid composure, turning back into a malleable, panicked mask. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice losing its polished veneer. "You'll crash the entire local grid. You're part of the system. You'll be deleted too." "Better a ghost than a puppet," I said. I slammed the car into gear, not at them, but toward the station's main utility junction box. I leaped from the moving car just before it smashed into the terminal's power hub. The explosion was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of sparks and shattered glass, turning the night into a blinding white void. The feedback loop triggered by the Omega-7 protocol worked exactly as I'd hoped. It wasn't just a shutdown, it was a total purge. The data that tethered the double to the network evaporated, and I felt the heavy, suffocating pressure in my head vanish. The streetlights died, plunging the station into total darkness. In that silence, I heard the men in the SUV cursing as they struggled with their locked doors. I didn't wait for them to escape. I slipped into the shadows, a true ghost now. I navigated the rail yards by memory, reaching the locker room in the basement of the terminal. I found locker 402, jammed the antique key into the lock, and swung it open. Inside wasn't a stash of weapons or forbidden cargo. It was a dossier, the original research on the project, evidence of the entire scheme, and the names of every official involved. I didn't call the police. I didn't trust the local authorities. Instead, I sent the entire contents of the locker to a secure, encrypted server belonging to the International Press Corps and an anonymous contact I had known from my previous life in intelligence. I knew that by morning, the entire conspiracy would be laid bare, and the group would be running from a fire they couldn't extinguish. I left the station and walked into the early hours of the morning. My phone was gone, destroyed in the chaos. I had no name, no past, and no wedding to attend. As I reached the edge of the city, I looked back once. The sirens were beginning to wail, a chorus of justice finally arriving for the wrong people. Elias would be exposed, his carefully constructed life of diplomatic status reduced to ashes by the weight of the evidence I had unleashed. I reached into my pocket and found one last item I had swiped from the car, a small, nondescript flash drive. It contained the override codes for the whole system. I stood on the bridge overlooking the river and let it slip from my fingers. I watched it disappear into the black, swirling water below. I was finally free. The prototype was gone, the lies were dead, and for the first time in years, The only voice I heard in the silence was my own. I turned away from the city, walking toward a horizon that was finally, truly, my own to choose.